Okay, so this is going to be, let's say, the first, or one of what may in fact be several efforts in video to talk about the Civium economy. It's a non-trivial exercise. There's a lot of different concepts that need to be held to be able to kind of make all the pieces fit together. And of course, we need to be able to move from high levels of abstraction to very concrete instantiations. So, yeah, we'll see. In this particular video, what I felt was a good thing to do was to bring, let's say, maybe two interlocking clusters of ideas out and spend a little bit of time on them. We'll see how that works out. So the first, I actually want to point to a research document by a group called Rethinkx, and I'll put a link in the video. It's very good. They use different language than I do. They talk about things like Humanity 1, Humanity 2, and Humanity 3. Whereas I tend to use things like Game A and Game B, and what I call Game 0 or Game Indigenous. But they're pretty similar. What I'd say is that they're the closest thing that I've seen thus far outside of the groups that I've actually interacted with directly in the proximity to the way that I'm telling the story about how this sort of thing is happening. So it's useful. And they come at it with a bit more of a kind of a consultancy language. And so, well, one, that's useful if that's the way your mind works, right? They can communicate that well. But also, two, it's a nice frame for thinking about things like technology and economy. The second thing I'd like to talk about is like maybe what are the right ways to think about the question of economy for Civium. And let's walk down that path a little bit. When we think about the question of economy or economics, finance, things like that, we have existing entity structures that have different ways of doing it. Right? So if you think about public and private, so if you think about private entities like, say, a corporation or a nonprofit, they'll have a series of accounting documents, balance sheets, profit and loss statements, cap tables, things like that, that will be the kind of the embodiment or the way that they show their state of rate and state of the movement of different kinds of ways that they can be in relationship with the economy. If you look at it from the point of view of the public, like say a city or a state, they have more something like a budget, and will have things like taxes, for example, is how they make their resources. The model that I'd like to put forward that I think is the best one, or at least the one that is most useful right now for Civium, is the notion of the nation state, and in particular, in the moment that I want to focus on right here, in particular, the notion of balance of trade. So when I think about a nation state, what I think about is an economy that has some pretty heavy complexity to it. I mean, and most nation states produce a lot of different kinds of things and can provision their interior, and the people who live in the nation state, with some meaningful fraction of the things those people use. So they are, to a greater or lesser extent, self-sufficient. And when I say greater or lesser, obviously, but what I mean is that a nation state tends to be vastly more self-sufficient than, say, a corporation. And if you put it on a continuum, you can take a corporation like, say, a Google, where their interior actually has a lot more to it than most corporations. They'll provision, say, for example, the famous lunch, right? The food. Most corporations don't provide your food, right? If you're in the interior, what they do is they give you money, and then you go out and you buy food, right? And you feed yourself. Google decided, okay, we're actually going to move that into our interior. And one of the things that we will provide as just sort of being in Google is food directly, not mediated by money. And when you're in a nation state, it's kind of an odd structure because nation states tend to use both money, the marketplace, and the commons or families to provide food. But it's all happening in the interior. Like you use U.S. dollars to buy food in the U.S. So, from that point of view, the U.S. happens to be relatively, well, that's not really true. The U.S. is a reasonably self-sufficient along certain dimensions, and of course imports an enormous amount of other things. Other countries more or less in different directions, right? But that, if you think about that abstraction, right, the notion of there being an interior, that interior provides some degree, some fraction of the total needs of the people who are in that interior, and then there's a relationship with the exterior, right, the resources out in the rest of the world that you have to get and bring in. All right, that construct is a construct that I'm going to be using a lot. All right, so When we're talking about Civium, we're talking about something that has an interior, and the interior is more like a nation state. Which is to say, it's an interior that has more, frankly, more intent to provision the needs of the people on the inside, the people in Civium, from its own interior. Right? It's not going to do that early, and it's not going to do that ever, I think, completely. But in the same notion that Google does it more than most companies, Civium does it more and more than Google. Right? You should expect to see a lot more of human needs being met by Civium itself, like in its own interior. And also, certainly in the beginning, and again throughout its whole evolution, there will be relationships with the exterior. And so one of the primary questions for Civium is going to be this question of the relationship across the boundary between the Civium itself and the exterior, which is to say the rest of the world. So in a later video, I'm going to go into some detail about what you might call the how of the relationship. What are the specific characteristics how the Civium will be in relationship with the rest of the world economically. But for right now, I just want to make that abstraction layer land. Right? So it's a question of imports and exports. How much can the domestic economy support, and how much of the needs of the people are imported from the outside world? What are the exports of Civium back into the outside world, and what's the balance of trade? Right? So those are the metaphors that I want to apply. Next concept, leaping back to Rethinkx, and this is really, if you can get a fine point on this, a lot of things come together. They talk about a lot, but the particular concept they talk about that I want to bring up is the fourth industrial revolution. Right? So if you're not super familiar, the basic notion is that we've gone through a series of industrial revolutions, each one of which has brought a significant wave of technological capacity that has disrupted the existing economic and political and social systems. We've then sort of settled on a new kind of political and social, and by the way, egoic identity structure around the capabilities of this technological wave. Settled for a while, then the next wave came. Right? So we've come through the third. We're sort of still in the process of trying to figure out how to stabilize the third, and now here along comes the fourth. And they spend some nice detail talking about the characteristics of what the fourth perhaps looks like. The point I want to focus on specifically is that the shift from one mode of production, one mode of industrial revolution to another, comes with a series of necessary and useful shifts in things like how one organizes around that mode of production, both at the group level, what we call the sociological level, and at the individual level, how people are developed, how the mind is constructed, how identities are constructed, language, habits, things like that. So, for example, the move from the agricultural era into the industrial era involved, for example, the movement of physical human bodies from farms into cities. Right? And it had to do things like train people how to play roles in the industrial infrastructure, which were very different from the mechanisms that we used to train people how to play roles in the agricultural environment. And I should point out that if you take a look at the interior, like the psychology and the narratives and the sense of self that was developed in that environment was different than the one that happened in the previous environment. And we could do the same thing over and over again. So, for example, if you look at the difference between, say, a Google or a Tesla, and let's use Google and, I don't know, IBM or HP or something like that, and then Tesla and, say, GM or Ford, not only are they operating in a different mode, like they're solving different kinds of problems, they're also solving them in a different way. Google quite famously actually took the problem of organizational design, organizational structure, hiring, human development as a core competency. They said, hey, look, this software development thing at a global level really actually needs to have an entirely new organizational approach applied to it. And if you do that well, that's actually more important than the output. Like the product of your software development is neato and makes money, but the process of how you actually do it is the core asset of the organization. And it worked, right? They did well. Same kind of idea with Tesla, right? They're really not a car company as much as they are a software hardware company that happens to be in the transportation domain, right? And they've adopted a lot of the competencies and approaches that were innovated in Silicon Valley, which are different than the ones that were innovated in Detroit in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that's part of the reason why they've been able to continue to make these leaps forward. The same thing with SpaceX, for example. So the notion that if you can orient your organizational processes which includes the relationality with individuals, how people are brought in, how people are given opportunities for development, how they're brought into relationship with each other. And if you can do this in a fashion that is well suited to the mode, to the technological framework that you're operating in, you can be more effective than people who don't. Right? Now, all of that is to say that at least a chunk, and in some sense a big chunk, of the design essence of Civium is around the appropriate approach to maximize the potential in the fourth industrial revolution. Okay, so what we're saying is, hey guys, look, we've got this really interesting sea change that's coming. And it's going to be a big one, by the way. If you read that report, it's significant. It's like actually a whole, it's kind of like the difference between November and December, which is a new month, and December and January, which is a new year. Like it's like an order of magnitude, bigger than the third and the second. So big change are coming, lots of disruption, like lots of entrenched, major players who we thought were awesome and powerful, but because the simple implications of the fourth industrial revolution, we're going to be uprooting a lot of that stuff. Why don't we think ahead? Like, why don't we, for kind of the first time ever in history, look at it, try to get a sense of how it works, and then design something that is sort of ready to take the baton early, and with, by the way, conscious intent to use the opportunity space as much as possible. If you kind of turn the clock back, imagine if like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, when they were really building the beginning of the third industrial revolution, the real serious first players, the Apples and the Microsofts, imagine if they had had two different aspects of what they were doing. One is they had a vision of Google, and they were actually able to design their organizations back then around the best of what organizations look like now, or frankly, the vision of Apple now, right? If Steve Jobs had been able to launch Apple then, with the wisdom of Apple now, right, what would that have looked like? And here's the other one, here's the big one. If they had actually come with an awareness of the possibility of how much change they could actually create in the world by virtue of riding this wave. So instead of coming in and saying, hey, we're just going to kind of play the industrial capitalism game of the mid-century with a different approach, and we're kind of like doing the same thing that everybody else is doing, but we're kind of doing software instead, and we're going to win, right? We want to become very rich and powerful in the terms of that old game. If instead of thinking that, they're like, actually, we think we can really change the whole game. Like we can consciously collaborate with each other and think about what the potentials are and start shifting big chunks, right? So a more conscious and intentional effort than a more of unconscious evolutionary things are just kind of getting disrupted and fitting together. I propose that if they had done that, it would have been, let's say, different and hopefully more meaningful in terms of moving the ball forward. The proposition of Civium is to say, let's do that. Let's be aware of it. Let's be aware of how we might design really, really well for the intrinsic characteristics of simultaneously how one goes about innovating the things, the aspects of the fourth industrial revolution, and how one begins to integrate the consequences in the social and interpersonal and personal so as to begin to discover the thing that holds that tool most deftly. And then let's use that deftness of tool and the power of those tools to change the world comprehensively in a direction, right, with some effort. So let's shift it from one place to another place. Now, you might link these two pieces together. Right? Roman numeral 1, nation state, balance of trade, imports, exports. Roman numeral 2, fourth industrial revolution. And if you had to focus on the simplest possible statement, the intent of Civium is to have a very powerful, positive balance of trade with the rest of the world by virtue of being much, much better at the fourth industrial revolution. Right? So to become the center of the innovation and the integration and the application of the opportunity space of the fourth industrial revolution, and essentially to export that back out to the rest of the world in exchange for the things the rest of the world produces that the Civium can't produce itself. Right? But the intent and the hope is this delivers the possibility of a profound positive balance of trade, which then means the Civium has a lot more agency in going about doing the kinds of things that it wants to do in the world.